Hello everyone and welcome into another edition here of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this chilly tri-state area Monday afternoon. But hopefully this show will brighten your day just a little bit. We should have a great one ahead. All things college football playoff championship, and also talking about what could potentially be next for the two semifinalists in Texas and Penn State. But all eyes on tonight between Ohio State and Notre Dame for all the marbles in the CFP championship game. Also, we'll be talking about belatedly the Mike McCarthy firing and the impact that will have on Dallas and their search for a new head coach, and also previewing an exciting matchup again in the Western Conference in the NBA, because that is the better, more loaded conference between the Wolves and the Grizzlies. Big one over there. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network if you need or want content such as this to keep up to date with all the shows going on around the network. But if you want to interact and contribute a little bit more directly to our shows, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions and thoughts and input out on air. I love reading all your comments. It just makes my show that much better, and it is genuinely appreciated by all concerned. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment, talking about tonight's CFP championship game between these two blue blood programs in Ohio State and Notre Dame. And it should be a good one. Let's talk about how these two teams got here, because we seem to forget that potentially both of these teams, if it weren't for the 12-team format, would not be here at all. And after two puzzling losses, the way these two teams regrouped, rebranded their identities, really was something to behold in the modern college football era. Let's start off with Notre Dame, because ever since week 2, it felt like they had to play every game like it was a playoff game, because they knew they had no margin for error, because that NIU loss was one of the most embarrassing of any team this season. And now they find themselves one win away from a national championship by having the most aggressive, passionate brand of football in all of college. On the Ohio State side of things, another loss to Michigan. This one perhaps the most embarrassing, heartbreaking, and baffling in Ryan Day's entire era as the Ohio State coach. Led them into the CFP with a lot of questions, potentially whether or not they should even be in the CFP. But they have thus far looked like the best team in the CFP. All the talent is producing at elite levels. Will Howard looked like the best quarterback in the CFP to date, and they are one win away from winning a national championship as well, and Ryan Day's first, potentially kind of dispelling the notion that he can't win the big games and he can't achieve what Ohio State fans want. But in terms of how this game will pan out, I think there are some clear and obvious advantages that both teams have, but also really important questions that need to be answered. And I think in my keys to victory for both of these teams, they're quite clear in terms of how they need to attack and approach this game. So without further ado, let's jump right into the keys to victory before I give my final predictions for this game. And unfortunately, it seems like I may have... I do have the graphic here for this game to explain my keys to victory. But ultimately, I do think that everyone is starting to understand what needs to happen for either Ohio State to perform how a lot of people expect them to, or Notre Dame to pull out the surprising upset. Let's start with Ohio State and what they need to do, because as always, the one question opposing defenses have to answer is, how are we going to stop Jeremiah Smith? But Ohio State also gave a blueprint into how they could operate should Jeremiah Smith be stopped, and I think that is their key to victory. Should Notre Dame, much like Texas tried to do in playing zone coverage, change their philosophies, Ohio State needs to exploit the middle of the field, because they have exceptional route runners outside of Smith as well. And Will Howard did an exceptional job in that game against Texas, taking what Texas gave him, which was the middle of the field where Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, and G. Scott exceptionally were able to ultimately give Will Howard that security blanket, despite Jeremiah Smith being blanketed on seemingly every single target. But I do think that, seeing as to how Notre Dame have gotten to this point by staying true to who they are, despite all these people saying, you need to change this, you need to change that, something needs to diversify, I think that Notre Dame are going to play man coverage from here on out. Throughout the entirety of this game, look for Notre Dame to stick with their identity, and that means that you run the risk of Jeremiah Smith going haywire on you. But if there are certain changes that Notre Dame do make as the game goes on, and if Ohio State starts to assert their dominance, look for Will Howard to adapt as well, because this Will Howard is different. With Kansas State, he didn't necessarily have that many weapons. He was, in my opinion, Kansas State's biggest weapon. Yes, he had solid running games there, but he never had receivers who could help him as much as this Ohio State receiving corps. And now it's allowed him to settle in as more of a pocket passer and allow these targets to get open for him no matter the coverage they face. And because of Jeremiah Smith being such an exceptional receiver, it now offers him even more opportunities to create down the field. And so, if I'm Ohio State, and I know that Notre Dame plays man coverage more than anyone in the country, I'm going to Jeremiah Smith, first and foremost, for the explosive plays. But if they do change things up, Will Howard has shown that he's competent at dissecting the middle of the field, taking what the defense gives him and ultimately extending and sustaining drives, which is what Ohio State loves to do when they can, because it's all fine and dandy to have explosive plays, but that could lead to this game becoming kind of a tete-a-tete shootout. Potentially, Notre Dame could stick around in that manner because they're, in my opinion, the better offense in terms of controlling the football up to this point. So I do think that both options are available for Ohio State. Because Notre Dame plays man coverage, the explosives will be there, or if Notre Dame switches up their style at some point in the game, I think that Will Howard has the blueprint to dissect that as well. So in my opinion, Ohio State are the clear favorites because they have two game scripts. One where Notre Dame changes and one where they don't. So it's going to be very difficult to slow down Ohio State. But in terms of Notre Dame, I think it's quite simple. I don't know if they're going to do this or achieve it for that matter, but do follow Texas' blueprint at some point. Because if you play man coverage for the entirety of the game, this one's getting out of hand. And this is no indictment on your defense, which has been incredible to this point. But think about it. Your best aspects of your defense lie in the secondary. You have an incredible secondary. When you look at the pass rush, there are incredible players up there. I love Howard Cross when he's healthy. But ultimately, the loss of Riley Mills leads me to believe that Notre Dame are not necessarily going to rely on their pass rush that much. They're going to have to rely on generating takeaways, which ultimately could happen because Will Howard is still that mistake-prone quarterback. You could potentially stay in this game by generating enough takeaways off of Will Howard's mistakes, but you can't necessarily think of that as much as you have to think about this receiving core, because this receiving core is one that really tests your patience, your resolve, most importantly, your mentality. And so, if Notre Dame follows the Texas blueprint, it means that they're going to have to trust their defenders to play a scheme that they don't necessarily play that often against perhaps the most elite receiving core in the entire nation. And so, in the final game of the season, this is really critical. Because a lot of people might think otherwise. Why change up now? Why, completely alter your identity to risk it all in a national championship atmosphere? But if I'm Notre Dame, I'm looking at your secondary and saying, I'm basically applauding you for all these people who believe this sentiment. I'm basically saying this Notre Dame secondary is elite enough to win this game for you. I know what they're capable of. They can generate takeaways unlike any other defense in the country, and I do feel that that could be the difference in this game, should Notre Dame ultimately win the turnover battle. But following Texas's blueprint for a team like Notre Dame, who plays man coverage on 57% of their dropbacks, the most in the nation, is easier said than done. Because, like I said, in a national championship game, you don't want to risk anything. But it's Ohio State on the other side of the football. This is a team that has completely ravaged the field in the CFP. And no matter what happened before, this team should, for all intents and purposes, win this game going away. But the only way I see Notre Dame really stepping up to this challenge is by trusting the secondary in an uncomfortable situation. Because that's what you need to do. I mean, yes, you can say that Texas was a little bit better equipped because of their zone coverage looks they've done throughout the season, but I do think that Notre Dame's secondary is just as good as that Texas secondary, and they can handle the pressure of playing zone coverage, in my opinion. But ultimately, it's up to them, and it's up to their style of play and how they want to attack this Ohio State offense. And then in terms of Notre Dame offensively, it's establishing the run. We all know what they're going to try to do to compensate for the many ways this Ohio State defense can attack them. But ultimately, it's going to come down to the defense for Notre Dame in winning this game. In terms of predictions, though, I do think Notre Dame, for a certain period of time, will stick around in this one, but I'm not necessarily confident they'll be able to stick around when it matters. Ohio State will begin to pull away, say, in the latter stages, the third heading into the fourth, and win this one 31-20, in my opinion. And it will ultimately come down to the fact that Will Howard is efficient enough should Notre Dame alter their defensive identity, say at halftime or so, in order to compensate for Jeremiah Smith, and that will be the difference. But let me know what you think of this game in the comments. It should be a good one tonight at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. But coming up next, we're going to be talking a little bit belatedly about this Mike McCarthy firing and how it could impact the Dallas Cowboys and their search for a new head coach right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our second segment of the day's show, before we get into it, I do want to remind you, as always, to consider availing yourselves to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. A great way, as always, to contribute and interact with the show. But without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment, talking a little bit belatedly about this whole Mike McCarthy situation and his firing from the Dallas Cowboys and what this means for the future of the organization as they search for their new head coach. But let's talk about the bizarre nature of this firing. To recap it all, it seems like this was more about a failure to reach a contract agreement rather than any complete and utter upheaval of the Cowboys' positioning with this. It feels like both Jones and McCarthy amicably split ways rather than this being something predicated by tension. And so that's what makes this a little bit weird in terms of how it came about, because we have been talking about this issue within the GSMC circle for many weeks now. And it's perhaps the first time in history that any of us here at the network have heard of a coach and an owner in this much agreement in how to part ways. I feel like this is the first time, and let me know in the comments if you haven't heard or have heard of something like this before, where an owner allows a coach's contract to run down and then fires him. Because usually during this period you extend a coach, potentially give him the hook a year or two early. But this was a contract winding down, Jones allowing it to expire, and then parting ways with McCarthy. And then if you look at this a little bit deeper, this could potentially also fall on McCarthy's shoulders as well. Because think about it. If I'm Mike McCarthy and I feel like I'm about to get fired, and I see the market around me in both college, say, and the NFL, and I'm hearing rumors about where I could end up, why not allow my contract to expire and then for Jones to make this decision about me? So it kind of feels like both of them or McCarthy really influenced this decision. And I feel like whether you believe the former or the latter, that either Jones completely came up with this or McCarthy kind of precipitated this as well, it's an interesting case study. Because, like I said, this is the first instance I remember or I recall throughout my lifetime where any kind of firing happened like this. But when I think about it on a deeper level, it certainly feels that McCarthy, in a situation where we always think of Jerry Jones as the ultimate arbiter in Dallas Cowboys business, really precipitated his own firing here. But then in terms of how the Cowboys now look at the field of head coaching candidates here, it does kind of come down to the question of, is Jerry Jones willing to do his due diligence, or are the two strong candidates that Cowboys fans and pundits alike have considered for the past couple of weeks, and Kellen Moore and Deion Sanders, the two guys that Jerry Jones are pinpointing first and foremost? Because let's be real here, Jerry Jones is going to be a stickler in this head coaching hunt. We know that he's going to want a guy who's going to be a yes man for him. And while that would eliminate Deion, I do feel like, it's the kind of hire that would add a little bit of glitz and glamour to the Cowboys situation. And while I don't necessarily think it's the best option out there for the Cowboys, that might be something that Jerry Jones might like. A little bit of glitz and glamour in Jerry world. And then the Moore thing, obviously, he was one of Jerry's guys here in Dallas when he was the quarterback backing up Dak for a couple of years. I think Romo as well, maybe not, but ultimately backing up Dak Prescott for that time and then becoming a semi-prolific offensive coordinator with both Dallas and now Philly. And being on that staff, I do think that makes him a favorable option. But when you look at this wide field here, and you're the Cowboys, you have to think we have to cast a wide net, no matter what Jerry's thinking. Because when you have a unique situation like this, where Mike McCarthy leaves after a tenure which saw him, for the most part, be consistent in how he coached this Dallas team, even though they never really broke through. I feel like you need a coach that is willing to understand that the Cowboys are in a better place than most teams looking for a head coach, and be willing to fall under the Jerry Jones umbrella. Because it's a very daunting task to do that, and Mike McCarthy, let's be real, he was a very willing coach during his time with Dallas. For the most part, he listened to Jerry, and he just really went out there and coached, and didn't necessarily, fall into this kind of reluctance at any point. But this firing was very weird. Let's be real here, in terms of how he left. And now this new head coach, seeing as to how Jerry, for all those years in the Mike McCarthy era, was the dominant force, was the focal point of all the Cowboys' business, I do feel like is someone who might fall outside these two candidates. And they did interview Robert Saleh, and he's an interesting case because he never really was given a chance with New York, potentially as well due to bad ownership, and is now interviewing in a job where he'll be seen of more as a yes man. But I think that the Cowboys do need to dig deeper here, because this is an exciting team, and yes, there's one big contract extension left to make with Micah Parsons, who's going to be really impertinent throughout the offseason, insistent on getting the money he believes he deserves. But I do think that there's a nice infrastructure there that was kind of Marty-esque by the Dak Prescott injuries, but also by, and this could also be a reason why McCarthy got the hook if this was a Jones situation here, was the fact that this offense stagnated outside of Dak and CD. And while I do believe that out of all the jobs available, the Cowboys are the most attractive, you have to think about the front office, and you have to think about that stagnation. And you also have to think about how these big contracts affect the rest of the team. How Dak coming back as well, when under Cooper Rush this team fought very valiantly over the last couple of weeks of the season, how that will impact them. And so while I do think that ambitious candidates like Moore and Dion, like pundits are saying, could be appealing, does it fit the Jones rhetoric, right? Does it fit the Jones agenda? I don't necessarily think so. These are two guys who will come in and want to insert their egos into the Cowboys' business. And I don't think Jones is prepared for that. Saleh, yes, is an interesting candidate because he falls under Jerry Jones' umbrella immediately should he get hired, which I don't think will happen, but ultimately isn't as ambitious as these other guys. I think the way to go, right, is now that surprisingly the Lions are out of the playoffs, try and get them even though they're very desirable and they might have their mindsets on where they want to go, or maybe if they leave the Lions at all. But you can't necessarily get in your own way if you're Jerry Jones and the Cowboys. You need to do your due diligence here, and you can't just feel like you're going into this with someone already in mind. You need to carry out the interviews. You need to hear people's ambitions and understand that this offseason is going to be a tenuous one within your organization. Because, like I said, this whole Dak coming back situation outside of the contract, this whole offensive stagnation, like I said, the Micah Parsons extension, which could be even lengthier potentially than the Dak and CD ones were, and now the new head coach. I feel like this team, for once, just needs to look inward and say, we can't bite the bullet here. We gotta do and operate like other teams do and operate. And so, if I'm the Cowboys, yes, it's fine and dandy to think big. But if Jerry Jones is going to rule with an iron fist, that's a little off-putting, to say Kellen Moore, should he want this job. And we'll talk about this throughout the week. But in terms of the Mike McCarthy firing, it is a little bit weird in terms of how it all went down and how kind of amicable it really was in terms of them parting ways. But let me know what you think, because I do feel that at the end of the day, this could be a situation that a lot of teams follow, even though it's Dallas, and who knows what either Jones or McCarthy were thinking when they made this decision. Because I feel like just letting the coach's contract run out and then giving him the hook is easier than, say, giving him an extension, potentially saying, this is my ultimatum to you, and then giving him the hook before it expires. Because it just makes a little bit more sense. And I feel like since it's Dallas, the league will follow it, but this is also a weird precedent set by Jones in how he does his business. Because I don't know where the Cowboys head from here, but I do know that it's going to be a roller coaster ride. And it's all going to be under Jerry Jones's fists. Let me know what you think in the comments below about this bizarre firing that I talked about, but a little bit belatedly. I had to get it in here, but let me know what you think, because coming up next, we're going to be talking about the losers in the CFP semifinals and what's next for them, starting off with my Texas Longhorns headed into the Arch Manning era. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, while we have previously looked at the winners of the college football semifinal, I've congratulated them on achieving this ultimate award here and getting into the CFP Championship. We have to talk about the losing teams here. Starting off with a team I'm all too familiar with in the Texas Longhorns, their second ever CFP semifinal appearance, but now in a new era, as Quinn Ewers, after a 21-5 record and an illustrious career at Texas, leaves for the draft, and Arch Manning takes the reins. Now, a lot of Texas fans are excited about this, but I would be holding my breath a little bit here, because this is a situation in Texas where you have a lot of guys leaving. And while Arch is very talented, and while he has seen some action this season, it is going to be a really interesting transition. Because I do feel like Quinn, as much as people try and put him down for his failings throughout his Texas career, was the perfect prototype for what Steve Sarkisian wants in a quarterback. And Arch is definitely someone with a much larger talent profile than Quinn was, but I do feel like it's going to come down to his rapport with Steve Sarkisian and his understanding of the offense that could really allow for this Texas offense to be special. But without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the impact some very integral players to this team's success this year leaving could mean, and also how Arch Manning is going to have to adjust to Sarkisian's scheme. But I do think this 2025 Texas Longhorns team, for all intents and purposes, has all its goals in front of it and can reach them as well. But Arch Manning, I do feel, has to be a big part as to why this offense goes, because they have a lot of exciting depth in the backfield, and I know Steve Sarkisian loves running the football in certain junctures in time, but you're losing a lot of receiver depth. Matthew Golden declared for the draft. I do believe Isaiah Bond just did as well, And while you have guys like DeAndre Moore and Ryan Wingo, who are a little underutilized this season, but perhaps are two of the better receivers you could return, I do feel like the big story is what's happening up front on that O-line. You lose your bookend tackles, and Calvin Banks and Cameron Williams, Hayden Connor as well declaring, and I believe Jake Majors will as well pretty soon. So that's 4 of your 5 guys on one of the best offensive lines in the country. And while a guy like Trevor Gooseby got some playing time due to all the injuries along the line late in the season, you're going to be breaking in, for the most part, an entirely new line. Guys like Andre Kojo, Brandon Baker are going to have to really step up. Cole Hudson, if he returns as well. But ultimately, that's the big question. Because Arch, unlike Quinn, has the escapability, the dual threat ability to compensate for if this offensive line struggles. But it's how and why he does it that's going to be important for Texas. Because Quinn, for the most part, was able to distribute to the speed and pace of these wide receivers. And so, yes, he has more in Wingo, but ultimately it's going to come down to who can step up. They recruited very well at the receiver position. They, I believe, have 2 top 30 guys. French, I'm really excited to see in this system. But ultimately, it's going to come down to Arch's decision-making and what Steve Sarkisian schemes up for him that really matters. Because Arch really controls his own destiny here at Texas. He can be one of the greatest Texas quarterbacks to ever grace the field, or because of the fact that Sark's scheme is so complex, and because of the fact he doesn't have a lot of the players up front and the receiving core that Quinn had, it could be a weird experiment. But ultimately, because of the overwhelming talent Arch has, make no ands, ifs, or buts about it, this Texas offense is going to be the most interesting in the entire nation. Because of what Arch is capable of, and because of all the changes. So, if you're a Texas Longhorns fan, prepare for a wild ride, like me. Because Arch Manning, he's here, but it's going to be an interesting era here at Texas. But let's talk about, like I said, a lot of the players leaving, because it's not just the offense, it's the defense as well. And this could have the bigger impact. Texas, for the most part, has been an interesting destination for a lot of defensive players, whether it be through the transfer portal or signing with Texas. And I think they've done an incredible job on the defensive side of the football, especially for compensating for all the losses. This year they had to replace perhaps 2 of their best interior linemen ever in Devondre Sweat and Byron Murphy, and they did it admirably with Broughton and Collins. They are gone. So that immediately presents a unique challenge, as well as Bill Norton leaving as well, who was incredibly important in the playoff as well, might I add. So that's an incredible challenge, because you now have 2 consistent years of fantastic interior D-line play, and it was a huge part of what got you to the playoffs, stopping the run. Now you're going to place a lot of big guys up front, but also you're going to have to score the transfer market as well. And so far, so good for Texas. They got a couple of signings. Justice Terry was a big signing. They've gone out into the transfer portal. I believe the guy's name is Brevard. Trey Moore announced that he'll stay for another year at Texas. So everything up front is really coming along in terms of how they can rebuild that line. But ultimately, that's a very integral part of what made this Texas defense so good. It was that interior defensive line and those ends. But ultimately, what I really like about the profile of this Texas defense in terms of returning players is the linebacking core. This is one of the best in the country. It's losing an incredible, underrated athlete in David Benda, and I really appreciate all he's done for this defense over the years. One of the most improved players in that entire unit this year. But you're returning Anthony Hill, the ultimate leader of this defense, Colin Simmons, one of the most underrated freshmen this year, and you have Trey Moore, who's an incredible, versatile player who can line up in terms of the line, but also in coverage as a linebacker. So you have a lot of versatility and depth at that position with a lot of veteran leadership as well, because Anthony Hill is a junior and Colin Simmons is going to be a sophomore, one more year in the system, and Trey Moore decided to return as well. So you're looking at one of the deepest, most experienced linebacking corps in the country, who are also a vital part of this Texas defense because they are the ultimate communicators. They really make this defense tick. They're the engine room, and they go how this entire Texas defense goes sometime. So that's really something that I'm really excited as a Texas fan to see return. But then let's talk with the secondary, because this is where a lot of losses are going to be either detrimental or hopeful for this Texas team. You lose Thorpe Award winner Jahdae Barron. You do still have guys like Jalen Gilbeau and Malik Muhammad, but ultimately Jahdae Barron was someone who could cover every inch of the field for you. And he was as much a communicator for the secondary as Anthony Hill was for the linebacking unit. So look for this Texas secondary to look a little bit more weakened than they have in recent years, just because of the ways that Jahdae Barron could contribute to this team. I'm not saying that both Gilbeau and Muhammad cannot improve, but these are guys who weren't really targeted that much and didn't really have the best statistical years when you look at it, because these two guys were, for the most part, very good players, but they weren't what Jahdae Barron made special about this unit, if you get what I'm saying. Jahdae Barron really was the glue that held this group together. He was someone who I feel a lot of these young guys could learn from, and it's going to be a challenge to see what they look like without him. Another big piece of the secondary that's leaving was a transfer in Andrew Makuba coming back to Texas from Clemson and truly being one of the most incredible ball-hawking safeties in the nation. Jahdae Barron did lead Texas in interceptions this season, but Andrew Makuba truly was one of the most important players in this Texas secondary. I love how they used him in both zone and disguises, and I do feel like in the future they're going to have to find another guy like Makuba, whether it be through the transfer portal or through bringing in someone through signing him. But ultimately, the development of the secondary group is going to be another important piece to the puzzle for this Texas defense. But I am really excited to see that they're still active in the transfer portal. They have one of the best recruiting classes in their history, and ultimately they're becoming a destination spot because that's what matters. But what's going to matter even more is the Manning effect, because this offense, for the most part, can be compensated for a little bit more with Manning than they were with Ewers. But ultimately, it's going to come down to, in my opinion, how Sark utilizes him. Because say Sark has a plan much like he did for Quinn, for Arch, and it's a little more conservative than people hope. How the fans react to it, how Arch reacts to it, will have a massive impact on this team, because a lot of players, a lot of fans are hinging their hopes on Arch. So that connection between him and Sark has to be the most important piece to the puzzle for Texas, because if that relationship doesn't get built up, if it's not strengthened in the offseason, then I have my doubts about how this team, going through a lot of changes, 19 players eligible for the draft, is going to look next season. But maybe Arch will be enough. And that's all Texas fans like me can hope for, because he truly is a special athlete who can compensate for a lot. But he's going to have to trust the players around him, and most importantly, the coaching staff as well. because it can be a fun ride down in Austin. But whether or not it's a special one is up to the man himself. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Coming up next, we're going to be looking at the other CFP semifinal loser in Penn State and what they have to do to finally break the duck in big games. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about them as well.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we looked at Texas. Now let us look at the Penn State Nittany Lions, the other loser in the CFP semifinals, what they have to do as well to ensure that 2025 is just as special as 2024. And most importantly, for a lot of fans of Penn State and pundits alike, it will come down to James Franklin. Much unlike Texas with Steve Sarkisian, who feel like they have a comfortable situation in terms of his ability to come up with game plans to beat the elite and the quarterback to do so in Arch Manning as well. James Franklin has been asked this question through his entire career. Can you beat the elite teams? And has failed almost every single time. He is now 1-18 against AP top 5 teams. And that formula, first and foremost, has to change before any structural change at Penn State. Because when I look at this Penn State roster and who they return and how they look under the Andy Kotelnicki regime and how Drew Aller has improved and how this defense improved as well, this has all the makings of a top 5 team yet again, a playoff team at that as well. But James Franklin has been the detriment of this team in big moments, and he simply can't be anymore. If you want to not just compete in the Big Ten, but beat Ohio State, beat Oregon, beat Michigan, and ultimately contend for national championships, you're going to have to find ways to beat the elite teams. And they were close this year, closer than they've ever been before. But this time around, it was squarely on the shoulders of James Franklin against Ohio State, and then putting up a stellar offensive performance against Oregon with simply not being able to keep up with them. And then in the playoffs, I feel like Notre Dame just managed the game better than you. There has to be some way, if you're the coaching staff of Penn State, to mitigate for this. Because it simply cannot happen if Penn State wants to be called an elite college football program. But looking at them compared to Texas, they return a similar level of talent. And unlike Texas at the quarterback position, they actually have experience, and most importantly, improved experience at the quarterback position with Drew Aller. And then one of the best running back tandems in the league return. But then in terms of departures, while they're not as many as Texas, they're equally, if not more important to the outlook of this team. Because Tyler Warren is one of the most special players in college football. And him leaving means you have to replace his production at the wide receiver position, a traditionally weak position for Penn State. And Penn State, for the most part, can tend to drip into the transfer portal, but haven't necessarily built through it effectively over these past couple of years. And then on the defensive side of the football, Denai Dennis Sutton's future is up in the air, but Abdul Carter is almost certainly going to be a first-round NFL draft pick. So it's going to have to come down to potentially a narrative shift in how this defense plays, potentially looking at their secondary stepping up, much like they did in the CFP next season, but also as well, potentially another dip into the transfer market. But seeing as to how Penn State was given new life with this 12-team format and will be for as long as they're in the Big Ten and for as long as their only 2 losses, say, are to Ohio State and Oregon each year, they have the chance to become an elite program. But it's going to come down more than anything to actually beating Ohio State and Oregon, because it's all fine and dandy if you're just trying to get into the 12-team format, but it's completely wrong if you want to win a national championship. And so I feel like Penn State are a weird team to analyze and dissect heading into next season, because they return a lot of talent offensively, right? You return Drew Aller, who had massive strides this year in his second season in the Andy Kotolnicki era. And then you return Nicholas Singleton and Cajun Allen, who were a big part of why you advanced as far as you did in the CFP. But when I look at this receiving core, nothing truly inspires me. When I look at players on the defense, outside of, say, the secondary, outside of the pass rush now, Sans Carter and potentially Dennis Sutton, it doesn't inspire me. And so I do think that Penn State's ultimate issue is how they approach the offseason. Because if you're a team like Texas, you become a destination spot, even though the SEC in many ways has lost a little bit of its luster in terms of recruitment and also in terms of being a marquee transfer destination. But in the Big Ten, it's now becoming a little bit more difficult because of all the teams in the Pac-12 entering the mix, and because of the fact that Ohio State has asserted its dominance. And while, a lot of these northern Big Ten schools do tend to recruit well, I can't necessarily say the same of Penn State. And I don't know why, but it's going to have to be compensated for by an ambitious approach in the offseason. If you fail to sign players who you feel could be immediate impacts for your team, you're going to have to start getting ambitious in the transfer market. And so, if I'm looking at the CFP picture and all the teams who are the elites outside of, say, the group of 5 teams, I'm looking at Ohio State, I'm looking at Texas, I'm looking at Oregon, I'm looking at potentially even a team like Tennessee, I'm looking at the Georgias of the world. These are big recruiting schools who are not going to go away, who are going to consistently in the future get top 5, top 10 recruiting classes. If you're Penn State, that's what you're contending with. And so while this year was a good platform for this program to build itself up, to give itself a reputation, you're going to also have to consistently beat the elite teams and prove that you can develop talent. This was a good start, but now this is really a season where different names, different stories have to be written. And so if I'm Penn State, I'm going to have to start thinking about becoming a big player in the transfer portal. So I don't necessarily know if, say, any of their recruited players or any players that they do get in the transfer portal will immediately help them, but it's an effort, right, to put a better product out into the field. Because, yes, what we saw out of Penn State this season was promising offensively, but then again, Tyler Warren was just that good of a player. And yes, while Nicholas Singleton and Cajun Allen were also a big part of what got you to the CFP, Drew Aller needs help. And it was pretty stark on that final drive. And so I do feel like right now they have the blueprint, right? They have a foundation where players can come to and say, we can compete for a CFP championship. But it's A, going to come down to ultimately James Franklin and how he approaches this new era in Penn State football history, and B, how this team now approaches modern aspects of the game. Because a lot of these up-and-coming teams aren't going to play dead for you. You are going to have to take initiative. You are going to have to ultimately find ways to compensate for losses. You right now hold your own destiny in your hands if you're Penn State. And it's a good place to be, but it's also daunting because never in their existence could they have imagined that now they were given a place at the table in the playoff field. Now that's true for a lot of these teams as well, though. So right now, Penn State, congratulations to you. It's going to be tougher the second time around because you're not going to have a do-everything security blanket in Tyler Ward anymore, and your defense is not going to have perhaps one of its best players this entire history anymore. And also, all these other teams are already planning ahead as well. So you're going to have to be battling a lot of blue blood programs to get to the top. It can happen, and it almost happened this year. You were one field goal away, but now this is what the future and impact of being a playoff team does to you. You have to think fast before others do as well. So if you're Penn State, you're going to have to continue building and building and building to finally break through. But let me know what you think about this team in the comments below, because coming up next for our final segment, we'll be transitioning to the world of the NBA. Another huge Western Conference showdown takes place tonight. It's Wolves-Grizzlies, when we get back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for our final segment of today's show, we transition to the world of the NBA. Another huge Western Showdown conference takes place tonight between two teams that I find really similar, but have had very, very different seasons. But ultimately, it's been down to one team being more maddeningly inconsistent than the other, rather than anything to do with their overall style of play. Let me tell you the story of this Wolves-Grizzlies game tonight and how important it can be for both teams. Let's talk about the Timberwolves first, because I feel like this team throughout the season has been more defined about what they did in the offseason than what they're doing now. Obviously, they trade away Cat to the Knicks, get Randall and DiVincenzo in return, and ultimately, yes, while it's a trade that could have worked out for both sides, the Knicks look just fine with Cat, and the Timberwolves have looked like shades of the team they were last season when they made it to their conference finals, but have been too inconsistent to make any ground in the loaded Western Conference. And this is not an indictment of them at all, but it's just the nature of how this conference has evolved these past 5 or so years. On the Grizzlies side of things, they've had their off-field issues as well, Ja Morant notwithstanding. But this is a team that I really think has the mettle to be one of the most intriguing come postseason time. They have one of the most electrifying offenses in the entire NBA, and when they get going, they're going to be a really tough team to beat, especially in transition as well. So this is why tonight's game between these two is so intriguing. You have the storylines of these two young stars trying to break through in this conference, but you also have the storylines of how differently their seasons are going. And so that's why, when I talk about games like this, they all seem to be happening in the Western Conference, and they all seem to be surrounding some young star. But I don't necessarily think this game for either team will come down to their young stars. It's going to come down to how the overall team plays. If I think with the overall team, the Grizzlies have the ball in their court. They're the better team. They're the deeper team in my opinion, and they just have more ways to attack you. Whereas the Timberwolves can attack you better than anyone in the league, similarly to what the Memphis Grizzlies do, but haven't put it all together, whether it be because of injuries, whether it be because of inconsistencies. And so that's why this game stands out to me. Let's talk about the outlook of tonight's game and what both teams need to do. So, as far as we know, for the Timberwolves side of things, Gobert and Dante DiVincenzo are game-time decisions. That's very intriguing because both of them help this team out in many different ways. Gobert being the focal point down low on both ends of the floor. Dante DiVincenzo could be a floor spacer for you. So it's going to be interesting to see, should both of them be out, how this impacts them on both the glass and on the perimeter. Then, obviously, for Memphis, Marcus Smart is out. Always been one kind of player, whether it be with Boston up to now, who has dealt with injury, and then Ja is a game-time decision, but I do think he will ultimately play because he's Ja Morant, and why not? But looking at how those injuries could impact the game, if I'm Memphis, I don't think a lot changes just because Ja Morant is out. You could still be this team who's potent in transition, who's potent down low. A lot more of your offense will ultimately have to go through Jaren Jackson, but he'll be fine with that. He likes driving to the rim as well. But if you're Minnesota and both Gobert and DiVincenzo are out, that eliminates a lot of your game plan. That really narrows how you approach this one because, like I said, Memphis's game plan is simple. Beat you in transition, beat you on the perimeter, and ultimately put up more points than you. Because that's what happened last week when these two teams met. The Wolves and Grizzlies last week played a classic, but the Grizzlies just outscored the Wolves in the end. They won 127-125, and that could very well be what we're looking at in this one. A game where the highest score ultimately wins the game. The team that can continuously put points on the board wins this one. So, if I'm Memphis, I still feel good about that. If I'm Minnesota, not so much. Because you're going to just have to, if you're the Timberwolves, do things that Memphis are better than you, better than them. And that's an impossibility no matter what. Because the Memphis Grizzlies are a team that can score in the high 120s, maybe even the 130s. And Minnesota are capable of that, but they just need everything to click. So here's the way, in my opinion, that everything could click, but ultimately might fall up short for Minnesota. You're going to have to crash the glass if you're Minnesota. And that's easier said than done against Jaren Jackson, who is fantastic on both ends of the floor, one of the Timberwolves' leading scorers, but also one of the best defensive players in terms of reading the game and ultimately winning on the glass as well. So if I'm Minnesota and if Gobert's out, you're going to need guys like McDaniels, Reed, crashing the glass, whatever you do. As Anthony Manzano said, is Memphis a good defensive team, or are they just one-dimensional? Now, I haven't necessarily watched much of Memphis to really say that they're, say, a good defense, but one thing they do well to compensate for any deficiencies is play offense. And potentially you could say that their best defense is their offense. Much like I pointed out their previous matchup last week, I do feel like the main problem for your opponent for Memphis is how you slow them down. But I do feel that you're right in saying that at some point a team can take advantage of Memphis's lapses defensively. Say an OKC. Say in the finals a team like Cleveland if they even get there. But for the most part, I'm kind of answering your question with my own kind of question here by saying, is Memphis' offense good enough to compensate for this defense? I don't know. But for games like this, where the other team is battling injury questions and they haven't been that consistent offensively, even though we know they can be, they should be just fine. The bigger questions will end up coming come postseason. But it's an interesting debate here because Memphis defensively aren't as elite as, say, the Rockets or the Thunder. And they're going to have to take them down in order to get to where they want to be. So it's an interesting question, but I don't necessarily know if it can be answered with the immediacy you might like. Let me just put it that way. But thank you for it because it brings up the point of how can this Memphis team evolve into something better than just an electrifying offense. As he also said, I agree with you, no matter how great your offense is, you can't defend anybody. A 30, 40, maybe even 50-point lead doesn't matter. And that could be the difference between it. But in this game, I ultimately think the Grizzlies have the ball in their court. But if I am Minnesota, and if I put together a consistent game, maybe Anthony's point comes to fruition here. Because if, say, Gobert plays, that gives you someone on both ends of the glass who can help in the rebounding department. Then in terms of, say, perimeter play, which I don't necessarily think Minnesota will want to lean into because they have so many elite drivers to the basket like Edwards, like Gobert. But if Dante's healthy, that gives you the three-point shot, that gives you the floor spacing you need to stretch this Memphis team. And Shaw's not necessarily the best defender in space. I feel like Dante being healthy would be a huge boon to this team. But then, ultimately, you also have to be confident in a player like Anthony Edwards if you are the Timberwolves, because he ultimately carries the destiny of this team on his shoulders. Because if he's on his game, he's a player who can take over no matter what. As Anthony says, if they're a young point guard that's on the bench of one of these playoff teams that's not getting enough playoff time that Miami can trade for to pair up with Hero in the backcourt, I'm not necessarily certain. I haven't necessarily followed the ramifications of what could happen should, the Butler drama go down. But I don't necessarily know. That's an interesting question, though. There could be a couple players, but I'm not certain that teams like OKC or Cleveland will want to trade them away just because a lot of these top teams are starting to rely on their depth a little bit more. Like, OKC does rely on a guy like Isaiah Joe more than you think. If you look at Boston, Pritchard's become a big part of what they're doing as well. So it's an interesting debate here, but one that's, I feel, can only get answered after the whole Butler saga plays out. Because if you're looking for a nice depth piece, it might come from a team, say, like Dallas or Orlando, rather than, as he also mentions, Topic, who I believe, is Topic already on the Heat? Let me look this up. Is Nikola Topic already on the Heat? I do think that he would be, okay, he is on the Thunder. I completely forgot about Nikola Topic for a second, as he is someone who could potentially be there, but then again, if, like I'm saying, development in this league does matter. And so I'm not certain the Thunder, who, yes, have an elite point guard, would want to give up someone who they view as a project. I feel like their team really looking to really cement their core and ensure that no matter what lineup they put out there, they can put up effective minutes. Maybe Topic isn't part of their plan. But ultimately, this is a question that I think is interesting, but not one I can immediately answer just due to the tenuous situation of Miami and how these teams use their depth at the top of their respective conferences. But my last thoughts here before we leave ultimately on the Wolves-Grizzlies matchup is that the Wolves really just want to find consistency. They want to find a win that really cements their status as a top contender in the West. And ultimately, if they win tonight, they're only 4 games behind Memphis in the loss column, but they're headed into a brutal stretch. They then have to play Dallas and Denver, and who knows what will happen in those games. So the Wolves need to set a good foundation here tonight, win or lose, that proves that they can find some level of consistency. But let me know what you think of this game in the comments. Thank you for your comments as well, Anthony. Continue them coming to any of you watching through the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features next time on the show. But that will just about do it. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As always, I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. I am out for today.